In the Soviet Union, the image of America was everywhere, but it was not the America that Americans themselves would have recognized. For the citizens behind the Iron Curtain, the United States was painted in propaganda posters, whispered about in kitchens, and glimpsed fleetingly through smuggled magazines, pirated radio stations, or the rare encounter with a foreigner. To understand what Soviet citizens really thought of Americans, we need to step inside their world of information control, state ideology, daily struggle, and the curiosity that existed in spite of it all. This is not a story of one opinion. It is a story of contradictions, of admiration and resentment, of fascination and fear. Because for many Soviet people, America was both a dream and a threat. From the earliest days of the Cold War, the Soviet state understood that controlling how citizens thought of Americans was a matter of national security. Official propaganda in newspapers like Pravda and on the evening news presented America as a land of poverty, crime, and exploitation. Posters showed workers in chains, starving children, and capitalist bosses counting money while soldiers prepared for war. America was described as the enemy of peace, the aggressor, the imperialist power seeking to crush the working man. For millions of Soviet citizens, this was the first and often only introduction to what America was. Schoolchildren learned that the United States was a land of inequality, where a handful of billionaires lived in mansions while ordinary people starved in the streets. Teachers repeated lines about racial injustice, unemployment, and constant violence. In history books, America was portrayed as the villain behind nearly every global conflict, while the Soviet Union was always the champion of peace. Yet the more propaganda worked to paint Americans as monsters, the more some Soviet citizens began to suspect that the story was incomplete. Even with all the hostility, there was fascination. Soviet citizens, like people everywhere, were curious. They wondered what it was like to live in America, a country that seemed so far away and so different. For many, the glimpses came in the form of cultural imports that slipped through the cracks of censorship. Jazz records were smuggled into Moscow and played in underground clubs where young people gathered to hear the forbidden rhythms. Hollywood films occasionally appeared in Soviet cinemas, carefully chosen to highlight negative aspects of American life, but audiences often paid more attention to the cars, the clothes, and the city streets than to the intended political message. Even cartoons like Tom and Jerry or Disney classics carried with them an aura of abundance and freedom. For Soviet youth in particular, America became a place of imagination. Blue jeans, chewing gum, rock and roll, these became symbols of a lifestyle that seemed unattainable yet endlessly attractive. Some joked that a pair of Levi's was worth more than gold. The truth is, Soviet views of Americans were not uniform. For some, especially those who lived through World War II, there was respect. During the war, the United States had been an ally. American Lend-Lease shipments, trucks, food, boots, even chocolate had helped the Red Army fight. Veterans remembered this and carried a quiet sense of gratitude, even when propaganda shifted to calling the United States an enemy again. Others, especially those deeply loyal to the party, truly believed the official line. To them, Americans were exploiters and warmongers. They believed that capitalist society was doomed to collapse, and that the United States was a place where ordinary people were crushed under the weight of greed. But for the majority, the reality was more complex. Soviet citizens could distinguish between the American government, portrayed as hostile, and the American people, who were often seen as fellow humans caught in an unjust system. In many conversations, there was sympathy for ordinary Americans, mixed with envy of their living standards and suspicion of their politics. To understand Soviet views of America, it helps to look at daily life. In the Soviet Union, people stood in endless queues for food, struggled to find consumer goods, and lived in cramped apartments. By contrast, they heard stories, sometimes through Western radio stations like Voice of America or Radio Liberty, of American supermarkets filled with products, of families living in houses with lawns, of cars in every driveway. For many Soviet citizens, this sounded like fantasy. Could it really be true that in America one could walk into a store and buy meat, butter, and fruit without ration cards, without waiting for hours? Could it be true that even ordinary workers had cars and televisions? This gap between propaganda and rumor created tension. Some believed it, others refused, thinking it was capitalist lies. And yet, those lucky enough to meet Americans at international festivals, sporting events, or cultural exchanges often came away impressed by their openness, friendliness, and wealth of possessions. One of the most striking moments came in the late 1950s, during the American National Exhibition in Moscow. For the first time, ordinary Soviet citizens could walk through an American-style model home, see American appliances, even taste Pepsi Cola. The famous kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev may have been about ideology, but for the people lining up to see dishwashers and modern kitchens, it was about curiosity and desire. These encounters left an impression. The sight of color televisions, shiny refrigerators, and casual clothing was shocking to many Soviet visitors. They realized that even if America had problems, its standard of living was undeniably higher than what they experienced at home. The Soviet government feared this fascination. It knew that the more citizens learned about the real America, the harder it would be to maintain control. That is why foreign magazines were censored, foreign films were carefully chosen, and foreign visitors were often followed by the KGB. But no matter how tightly information was controlled, curiosity found a way. Radios could pick up foreign broadcasts. Sailors and diplomats brought back items from abroad. Black markets circulated American jeans, cigarettes, and music. Each item carried symbolic weight. A single pair of Levi's could spark envy and admiration in a whole neighborhood. The deeper truth is that Soviet citizens often held two feelings at once: admiration and resentment. On one hand, they admired the wealth, the freedom, and the cultural creativity they associated with America. On the other, they resented the inequality, the consumerism, and the arrogance they were told defined American life. In many kitchens, late at night, people would whisper contradictory things. Some would say, "Americans are lucky, they live so much better than we do." Others would reply, "Yes, but they are slaves to money, they have no real soul, no community." This mixture of attraction and rejection was a hallmark of Soviet views. By the 1980s, as the Soviet economy faltered and shortages grew worse, admiration for American living standards increased. Gorbachev's reforms opened up more contact with the outside world, and Soviet citizens saw more clearly just how far behind they had fallen. The image of America shifted from that of a threatening enemy to that of a successful, if flawed, society. When McDonald's opened in Moscow in 1990, thousands lined up not just for a hamburger, but for a taste of something they had only imagined. For many, it symbolized the end of the old propaganda and the beginning of a new era. Even today, memories of what Soviet citizens thought of Americans are complex. Older generations remember the propaganda and the shortages, the envy and the skepticism. Younger generations, who grew up after the collapse, inherited both the fascination and the suspicion. The Soviet Union may be gone, but the long shadow of its propaganda still lingers. For decades, citizens were told what to think about America. Yet beneath the official lines, real opinions were more nuanced, shaped by curiosity, by daily struggles, and by the rare but powerful glimpses of another way of life. So what did Soviet citizens really think of Americans? They thought of them as enemies, as allies, as rivals, and as people not so different from themselves. They saw in them both danger and inspiration. They envied their wealth, mocked their culture, and dreamed of their freedoms. It was never one story. It was a tapestry of contradictions, woven from propaganda, rumor, and imagination. And perhaps the most important truth is this: even in the most closed society, even under the tightest control, people remained curious. They wanted to know what life was like on the other side. That curiosity, about America, about freedom, about another way of living, was something the Soviet system could never fully erase.